house went quiet the moment they left, not the calm kind of quiet, the kind that feels carefully maintained. I stood in the living room for a moment, listening to the sound of a car pulling away, thinking about nothing more than how long the weekend would feel. I thought I was just there to help, just to keep an eye on things, just to make sure everything stayed normal. Lucas was sitting on the floor, drawing. He didn't look up right away. He never rushed when adults were around. Then he lifted his head and asked almost casually, "Do adults always tell the truth? Or just what keeps everything quiet?" The question didn't sound curious. It sounded practiced. That was when I understood something was wrong. Because children don't ask questions like that unless they've been listening for a long time. The silence in this house wasn't accidental. It wasn't peaceful. It was protecting something. And whatever it wasn't the child. The house went quiet the moment they left, not the calm kind of quiet, the kind that feels carefully maintained. I stood in the living room for a moment, listening to the soft echo of a car pulling away at the end of the street. Willow Creek always sounded the same on weekends. Wind through the trees, a distant lawnmower, a neighbor's screen door closing. Familiar, predictable. Nothing that suggested anything was wrong. I told myself I was just helping for a few days, just keeping things steady, just making sure everything stayed normal. Lucas was sitting on the floor near the window, coloring without rushing. He didn't look up when I moved. He rarely did when adults were around. He had a way of staying present without drawing attention to himself, as if he'd learned that being unnoticed was safer than being seen. "Do you want to do something first?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He nodded, but didn't answer right away. He finished filling in the corner of a page, pressed the crayon down once more, then set it aside with care. Only then did he look up. "Do adults always tell the truth?" he asked, "or just what keeps everything quiet?" The question didn't sound curious. It sounded practiced. I felt it land between us, heavier than it should have been. Children ask strange questions all the time, but this one had weight. It had timing. It felt like something that had been waiting. I sat down across from him, matching his level without making it obvious. "Why do you ask?" I said. Lucas shrugged, the way kids do when they're not sure how much they're allowed to say. "I was just thinking," he replied. His voice was steady, too steady for a child his age. I nodded and let the silence sit. I'd learned that pushing too quickly closed doors. Lucas watched me closely, as if checking whether he'd said too much. That was the first moment I understood that the quiet in this house wasn't accidental. It wasn't peaceful. It was protective. Margaret had asked me to stay at the last minute. She'd framed it as practical. Work obligations, a short trip, nothing complicated. The explanation had sounded reasonable, the way explanations do when they're designed not to invite questions. "Lucas is easy," she'd said on the phone. "He keeps to himself." At the time, I'd taken that as reassurance. Now, watching him carefully choose his words, I realized it was something else entirely. The house itself reflected the same careful balance. Everything was in its place, not because it was loved, but because it was expected to be there. The couch pillows aligned just enough to look intentional. The counters were clean without feeling lived in. Even the clocks were set precisely, as if time itself wasn't allowed to drift. I asked Lucas if he wanted a snack. He nodded again, polite, quiet, waiting. In the kitchen, I noticed how he stood, close enough to see, far enough not to interrupt. He watched what I did, not with suspicion, but with attention. The kind of attention that comes from listening more than speaking. "You can sit," I told him. "I'm okay," he said. That answer came quickly, too quickly. We ate in near silence. Not uncomfortable, exactly, just measured. Every sound seemed amplified. The clink of a spoon, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the wall clock. Lucas didn't fidget. He didn't rush. He moved like someone who had learned how not to be noticed. Afterward, he carried his bowl to the sink without being asked. "You don't have to do that," I said gently. "I know," he replied. "I just like things to stay nice." Stay nice. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. As if nice was something fragile, something that could break if handled the wrong way. Later, we sat in the living room again. I picked up a book and began to read out loud, keeping my voice low and steady. Lucas leaned against the arm of the couch, listening without interrupting. When I paused, he didn't rush to fill the space. That was when I noticed it. He wasn't waiting for the story. He was waiting for me, for my tone, for my pace, for whether I would stop reading when he shifted or continue without comment. "You can tell me if you want me to stop," I said. He shook his head. "It's okay," he replied. "I like when things stay the same." The words echoed the way his earlier ones had, carefully chosen, repeated for a reason. As evening settled over Willow Creek, the house grew quieter, not emptier, but more contained. Lucas moved through the rooms without noise, as if he knew exactly which floorboards to avoid. When the lights came on, he didn't ask. He waited. That night, as I tucked him in, he looked up at me again. "You're not mad," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," I replied. "Why would I be?" He thought about that for a moment, then nodded, satisfied. When I turned off the light and stepped into the hallway, I paused. The house was silent again, but now it felt different. Not calm, not restful, watchful, and somewhere between Lucas's careful questions and the way this quiet had been arranged, I understood something I hadn't when I arrived. This wasn't a house that valued silence. It depended on it. To understand why Lucas spoke the way he did, you have to look back before the house learned how to be quiet. There was a time when he wasn't. Margaret once showed me a video on her phone. Lucas at 4, standing on a chair, narrating a story to no one in particular. His voice was quick and excited, words tumbling over each other as if he were afraid they might escape without him. Margaret laughed when she showed it, proud in a distant way. "He's changed," she said then, not unkindly. "He's more thoughtful now." At the time, I believed her. In Willow Creek, people valued thoughtfulness. Calm homes, children who didn't interrupt. Silence passed easily as good behavior, especially when it arrived without protest. Lucas learned early which moments welcomed questions and which closed around them, not through rules, but through patterns, the kind that settle quietly into daily life. When he asked why plans changed, the answer was always the same. It's complicated. When he asked where someone had gone, he was told, "That's adult stuff." When he lingered in doorways during conversations, voices softened and sentences ended. No one told him to stop listening. They assumed he already had. Margaret never raised her voice. She didn't have to. She corrected with pauses, with glances, with a tone that suggested disappointment without naming it. Lucas noticed the difference immediately. The first time he interrupted her on the phone, she covered the receiver and said quietly, "Now isn't the time." She didn't sound angry, but the call ended sooner than usual. After that, Lucas learned timing. He learned to wait until conversations felt finished, not paused, but sealed. He learned to read the air in a room the way some children read faces. At school, teachers described him as easy. Independent, they said, mature for his age. No one asked what maturity had cost him. At home, silence became useful. When Lucas didn't speak, plans moved more smoothly. When he didn't ask questions, evenings stayed calm. Margaret seemed relieved on the days he disappeared into books or drawings without needing anything. "You're so good at entertaining yourself," she told him once. Lucas took it as praise. There was one afternoon years earlier when the shift became permanent. He'd overheard something he didn't understand. Not fully. His name hadn't come up. Mine had. The tone was careful, almost reassuring. Words like "later and better this way" floated through the hallway. That evening, he asked a question at dinner. Just one. Margaret set down her fork and looked at him for a moment too long. "Sometimes," she said, choosing her words carefully, "talking about things makes them harder." Lucas nodded, absorbing that. "But if you don't talk about them," he asked, "do they go away?" Margaret smiled, thin and patient. "They don't need to be discussed to be handled." That sentence settled into him. Handled meant controlled. Controlled meant quiet. After that, Lucas spoke less, not because he was told to, but because he understood the reward. Calm rooms, predictable nights, a sense that nothing would shift unexpectedly. Silence didn't feel like loss. It felt like safety. Margaret noticed the change, but she framed it the way people do when something inconvenient becomes manageable. "He's grown out of the chatter," she said to neighbors. "He's just observant." She wasn't wrong. Lucas observed everything. He noticed when conversations stopped when he entered a room, when certain topics only appeared after bedtime, when reassurance came faster than explanation. He noticed how often "everything's fine" replaced answers. Over time, silence stopped being a response. It became a role. Lucas filled it carefully. By the time I arrived for that weekend, the habit was already settled. Years in the making, polished by routine, reinforced by comfort. He wasn't quiet because he lacked words. He was quiet because words had consequences. And in a house that valued calm above clarity, silence felt like the most responsible choice a child could make. That was the past that shaped the present. A history no one announced, a lesson no one wrote down, just a pattern that worked until it didn't. Because the kind of silence Lucas learned to keep wasn't empty. It was full of listening. And when someone listens long enough, eventually they hear something that changes the balance. Something that makes silence feel less safe than speaking. That moment was coming. He didn't know when, but he was already prepared for it. Lucas didn't mean to overhear anything. He never crept closer, never pressed his ear to doors. He didn't need to. In this house, adults spoke freely as long as they believed the room belonged to them. Silence made him invisible. It started with small fragments, sentences without beginnings, conclusions without context. Not this week. She'll understand later. It's easier if we don't explain everything. Lucas heard these phrases often enough that they stopped sounding accidental. They formed a pattern, one that didn't require him to know every detail to recognize its shape. The evening that stayed with him happened months before I arrived. He'd gone to his room early as he usually did. The light under his door stayed off. He sat on the floor with his back against the bed, drawing quietly. From there, he could hear voices drifting from the kitchen, low, unhurried. Margaret was on the phone. Her tone was different then, not the one she used with neighbors or teachers. This one was controlled, precise, like she already knew the outcome of the conversation. "I've thought it through," she said. "It's better if it stays simple." Lucas didn't know what it was, but he knew simple meant quiet. The person on the other end of the call asked something that made Margaret pause. "No," she replied. "She doesn't need to know yet." My name came up not long after. Lucas froze. Not because he was scared, but because he was listening. Margaret spoke about timing, about how people reacted when they were overwhelmed, about how confusion could make things harder than they needed to be. "She trusts me," Margaret said. "That's enough." Lucas didn't understand why my trust mattered, but he understood that it was being used. The next day, he noticed how carefully Margaret framed everything, how explanations arrived before questions, how reassurance replaced detail. Nothing sounded threatening. That was what made it unsettling. Over the weeks that followed, Lucas heard more. Not a single conversation. Many. Pieces that didn't make sense alone but fit together when placed side by side. References to paperwork that was already handled. Mentions of how people rarely double-check things when they're tired. Comments about how important it was to keep everything calm. One night, someone laughed softly and said, "She won't even notice." Lucas felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear. Recognition. Adults weren't worried. They were confident. That was the moment he realized this wasn't just talk. It was planning. Quiet planning. Designed to look like nothing at all. Lucas did what he'd learned to do best. He stayed silent. He watched how often Margaret checked the calendar, how she repeated details about upcoming days as if practicing them, how she reassured people before they expressed concern. He noticed how his own presence changed conversations, how voices softened or stopped when he entered rooms, how he was gently redirected to his room more often than usual. "Go draw for a bit," Margaret would say. "I need to focus." Focus on what? Lucas wondered. The answers came slowly, not in words, but in behavior. Margaret began preparing things ahead of time. Bags placed neatly by the door, notes written with careful handwriting, instructions given casually, as if they were afterthoughts. Lucas watched it all without comment. He didn't know what the plan was, but he knew enough to understand one thing. It relied on everyone staying exactly where they were supposed to be, including him. That was when silence started to feel heavy. Not safe. Heavy. The final piece came the night before Margaret asked me to stay. Lucas sat on the stairs with a book open on his lap, pretending to read. The lights downstairs were low. Voices drifted up easily. "This weekend makes the most sense," Margaret said. "She'll already be here." Someone asked a question Lucas couldn't hear. Margaret answered without hesitation. "She won't question it. She never does." There was a pause. Then, if anything feels off, she'll blame herself. She always does. Lucas closed his book. My name echoed in his mind, not as a person, but as a variable, something predictable, something counted on. That was when he understood his silence wasn't neutral anymore. It wasn't just keeping things calm, it was allowing something to happen. He didn't sleep much that night. When I arrived the next day, Lucas watched everything closely, where I set my bag, what I touched, how I reacted to small things. He didn't rush to speak. He waited. And when he finally asked his question about truth and quiet, it wasn't curiosity. It was a test to see if I was someone who would listen. Because Lucas had learned something important while staying silent all those years. When adults think a child isn't paying attention, they say things they don't mean to explain. And when someone listens long enough, even the quietest plans start to show their shape. After Lucas spoke, I didn't react the way people expect. There was no confrontation, no sudden questions, no rush to prove anything. I thanked him for telling me, that was all. Then I did the most important thing I could do in that moment. I made the house feel the same. Breakfast happened at the usual time. The radio stayed low. The day moved forward without signals that something had shifted. Lucas noticed. "You're not upset," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "I'm paying attention." That seemed to ease something in him. I understood then that if there was a plan moving quietly through this house, it depended on predictability, on the idea that I wouldn't slow down and look closely. So I did exactly that. I slowed everything down. I didn't touch the bag by the door. I didn't comment on the notes left on the counter. I didn't ask Lucas to repeat what he'd heard. He had already carried enough. Instead, I started noticing details the way he had learned to. Timing, placement, language. Margaret's messages arrived exactly when expected. Calm, reassuring, designed to sound helpful rather than directive. Each one ended the same way, with certainty. Everything's taken care of. You don't need to worry. It's simpler this way. Simple, I'd learned, often meant unexamined. That evening, after Lucas went to bed, I opened my notebook. I didn't write theories. I wrote observations. What was said when it was said and what wasn't explained. I noted patterns, repetition, the absence of follow-up questions. Facts didn't argue, they accumulated. The next morning, I made a call to someone I trusted, not to alarm them, but to ground myself. I described what I'd noticed without assigning intent. I asked what steps people take when something feels wrong but hasn't crossed a clear line yet. Document, they said, and don't act alone. So I didn't. Over the next 2 days, I kept things steady on the surface. I mentioned being tired. I let conversations drift. I didn't challenge reassurance. I accepted it. Behind the scenes, adults began to move, quietly, responsibly. I reached out to a child advocacy professional and asked how to proceed without putting pressure on Lucas. They listened carefully. They didn't rush. They didn't ask for names right away. "What you're describing sounds like a pattern," they said. "Patterns matter." Guidance followed. Not instructions, but structure. Who to speak to, what to record, what not to do yet. The emphasis was clear. Safety first, clarity second, speed last. Lucas felt the change before it was explained to him. The house sounded different. Not louder, but less tense. Conversations didn't end abruptly when he entered rooms. Doors stayed open. Questions were answered plainly. "Are we okay?" he asked one afternoon while we walked home. "Yes," I said. "We're being careful in a good way." He nodded, satisfied. Margaret's tone shifted subtly as days passed. Messages became shorter, less certain. Reassurance began to repeat itself, as if repetition might restore control. People who feel secure don't check as often. People who feel watched do. I continued to appear untroubled. I didn't signal preparation. I didn't change plans. I didn't share concerns beyond the small circle that needed to know. That restraint mattered, because plans that rely on quiet rarely account for attention. By the end of the weekend, the space for assumptions had narrowed. Decisions were no longer made in passing conversations. Oversight appeared where there had been none. Questions were asked, calmly, officially, without accusation. Lucas wasn't present for any of it. That, too, was intentional. One evening, he asked, "Did I do something big?" I sat beside him. "You did something important," I said, "and now other adults are doing their part." He seemed relieved by that division of responsibility. Later that night, as I stood at the kitchen counter, I noticed how ordinary the house looked. Same lights, same furniture, same quiet. But it wasn't the same quiet. It no longer belonged to secrecy. It belonged to care. When adults begin to act responsibly, they don't announce it. They create structure. They replace assumption with process. They make room for facts to be seen without pressure. That's what was happening now. Whatever had been planned to move smoothly through this weekend had lost its advantage. Not because it was exposed, but because it could no longer move unseen. Lucas had done the hardest part already. He'd spoken. Everything after that was simply adults catching up. Once the adults began to move quietly in the background, the most important thing for me to do was nothing. At least, nothing that could be seen. I didn't confront Margaret. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't change the rhythm of the house. If something depended on being unnoticed, then noticing it too loudly would only send it elsewhere. So I stayed steady. I let mornings unfold the same way. Coffee first. Curtains halfway open. Lucas at the table with his notebook drawing shapes that slowly turned into careful scenes. I didn't hover. I didn't watch him watch me. We talked about ordinary things. What he wanted for lunch, a book he was reading, whether it might rain later. I kept my tone neutral, unhurried. Lucas understood more than I expected. "You're acting normal," he said one morning. "I am normal," I replied. "Normal can be very useful." He considered that, then nodded. The messages from Margaret continued, arriving with the same reassuring cadence. Short check-ins, gentle suggestions, phrases designed to sound supportive without inviting response. "Hope everything's going smoothly. Let me know if you need anything. Don't overthink it." I didn't reply right away. When I did, I kept it brief, polite, uninformative. "All good here. Thanks." No details. Behind that calm surface, time was doing its work. Documentation grew quietly. Notes became timelines. Timelines became context. Context became clarity. None of it required urgency, only consistency. I shared updates only when asked, and only with the people who needed them. I followed guidance carefully. No speculation, no assumptions, just what could be confirmed. Lucas noticed the discipline. "You don't talk about it much," he said one evening as we washed dishes side by side. "That's on purpose," I told him. "Some things work better when they're not announced." He rinsed a plate thoughtfully. "Like waiting your turn," he said. Exactly like that. The house remained calm, but it wasn't empty. It was alert in a quiet way. Doors stayed open. Lights stayed on a little longer. Nothing dramatic, just enough presence to make assumptions uncomfortable. Margaret's tone shifted again. Messages came closer together now, as if reassurance needed reinforcement. "You're doing great. Lucas okay? Everything still fine?" I answered the middle one. "He's fine." That was true. He was sleeping better, eating without rushing, asking small questions again, safe ones, the kind that test the ground without stepping too far. One night, after he'd gone to bed, I stood in the hallway and listened to the house. The familiar sounds were there. The clock, the refrigerator, the soft settling of walls. But beneath it was something else. Waiting. Buying time isn't about delay. It's about alignment, making sure that when something finally moves, it does so into prepared hands. I made sure Lucas understood that. "You don't have to do anything else," I reminded him. "You've already done what mattered." He looked relieved, but also curious. "What happens next?" he asked. "We let grown-ups handle grown-up things," I said, "and we keep things calm." He accepted that easily. Children often do when the rules are clear. As days passed, the surface calm did its work. Nothing escalated, nothing rushed. The absence of reaction became its own signal. Plans that rely on momentum stall when momentum disappears. One afternoon, Margaret called instead of texting. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened later, her voice was still composed, but tighter. "Just checking in," she said. "Call me when you get a chance." I didn't. Not yet. Silence, when chosen, has weight. Lucas noticed the difference between silence and avoidance. "You're not ignoring her," he said carefully. "You're waiting." "Yes," I replied. "Waiting is a kind of answer." That evening, we sat on the couch reading. The same book, the same chapter. Lucas leaned against the cushion, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen before. The house felt steady, not because nothing was happening, but because everything that needed to happen was already in motion. Buying time wasn't about pretending nothing was wrong. It was about refusing to be rushed into the wrong response. And in that space, between calm appearances and careful preparation, something important was happening. Control was shifting. Not through confrontation, not through exposure, but through patience. And patience, I was learning, was the one thing quiet plans never accounted for. The shift from waiting to action didn't come with an announcement. It came with an appointment. A weekday afternoon, a neutral building, a room that didn't feel like it belonged to anyone. No personal photographs, no symbols. Just chairs arranged in a way that suggested conversation rather than confrontation. Lucas noticed everything as soon as we sat down. "This room doesn't feel like trouble," he whispered. "That's because it isn't," I said. "It's for listening." Before anything began, the process was explained. Slowly, clearly, without pressure. Who would speak first? What Lucas could share? What he didn't have to share? That he could stop whenever he wanted. Control was returned to him in small, careful pieces. When Lucas spoke, he didn't tell a story. He described moments. Where he was sitting. What time it was. Which words stayed with him. No one interrupted. No one asked him to guess at motives. No one rushed him toward conclusions. The room stayed quiet. Not the heavy kind, but the kind that holds space. When he finished, he looked at me as if checking whether he'd done enough. "That's all," he said. And it was. He was thanked. Not praised, not questioned further, just acknowledged. Then he was allowed to leave the room. That part mattered most. Lucas went with a counselor to draw in another space, where nothing important was being decided around him. What followed belonged to adults. I stayed behind. What I shared wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. I laid out what I had documented. Dates, messages, repeated phrases, shifts in tone. How reassurance had replaced explanation. How timing had been emphasized. How calm had been treated as a goal rather than a result. No assumptions, no accusations. Just sequence. Sequence changes everything. When moments line up across time, they stop looking isolated. They start looking intentional. Clarifying questions followed. Not challenges, but confirmations. When did this begin? How often did this happen? Who was present? Each answer fit into place without force. By the end of the meeting, the language had changed. No one was talking about misunderstandings anymore. They were talking about responsibility. Ethan, Lucas asked later in the car, "Was that it?" "For you," I said. "Yes." He seemed relieved by that. Over the next few days, confirmations arrived quietly. Reviews were conducted, records compared, timelines matched. Each piece reinforced the same conclusion, not because anyone insisted, but because nothing contradicted it. The truth didn't arrive dramatically. It arrived consistently. That consistency mattered. When people rely on quiet to manage outcomes, they rarely expect that quiet to be documented. But documentation is simply quiet made visible. Margaret was informed through formal channels. The tone was professional, neutral, focused on next steps, not explanations. She requested to speak with me directly. I declined. Not emotionally, procedurally. That communication should go through the appropriate process, I said. There was a pause before the response came back. That pause said enough. Lucas noticed the change in the house before I explained it. "They're careful now," he said. "Yes," I replied, "because they're being watched in the right way." That evening, as we sat at the table doing homework, the ordinary sounds returned. Pages turning, pencil tapping, a chair shifting. The house felt settled, not resolved, but grounded. Later, Lucas asked something quietly. "Am I going to have to talk about this again?" I answered honestly. "Only if you choose to. and only with people whose job is to keep you safe." He nodded, satisfied with that. That was when I understood what this part of the story truly was. Not exposure, not confrontation. Confirmation. A moment where what had been carried quietly was placed into a structure strong enough to hold it. Once the truth was recorded, clearly, calmly, without pressure, it no longer depended on memory or silence. It belonged to the process. And once something belongs to the process, it stops being a burden for a child to carry. The confrontation didn't happen in a raised voice. It happened in writing. Once the statements were recorded and the timelines aligned, the situation moved into formal channels where tone mattered less than sequence. Notices were sent, meetings were scheduled, expectations were set in language that didn't invite interpretation. That was when the plan began to collapse. Not all at once, piece by piece. Margaret received the first request for clarification through official correspondence. It was brief, neutral, focused on documentation rather than intent. There was no accusation in it, only questions that required answers. She responded the way she always had, calmly, confidently, with assurances that everything had been misunderstood. "There's been confusion," she wrote. "Things were taken out of context. Context, however, only works when moments are isolated. Placed side by side, context becomes comparison, and comparison reveals patterns. Follow-up questions arrived, then requests for records, then timelines that no longer matched the explanations provided earlier. Each step narrowed the space for assumption. Margaret asked again to speak with me directly. This time, the request sounded different, less certain, more urgent. "I think we can clear this up," she said in a voicemail. "It doesn't need to go further." I didn't respond, not because I was angry, but because the process no longer belonged to me. People who rely on private conversations often underestimate what happens when decisions move into rooms with minutes and witnesses. Lucas didn't see any of this. That was intentional. What he noticed instead was a shift in atmosphere. The house felt quieter, but not heavier, more deliberate, less reactive. "They're careful now," he said one afternoon, "like they don't want to say the wrong thing." "That's because words matter when they're recorded," I told him. He thought about that, then nodded. The next meeting took place without us present. Professionals spoke to professionals. Questions were answered, or not. Silence, when it appeared, was noted. That silence carried weight, because silence in a formal process isn't neutral, it's information. The plan, whatever shape it once had, couldn't survive under sustained attention. It depended on assumptions, that people wouldn't ask too many questions, that reassurance would be accepted, that quiet would be mistaken for agreement. Those assumptions failed, not dramatically, thoroughly. Margaret's explanations grew shorter, her certainty thinned. Requests for extensions appeared. Time to gather information, time to respond, time to clarify. Time, however, was no longer something she controlled. The structure did. At one point, a separate representative was requested, another sign that alignment had fractured. Plans collapse fastest when the people involved stop protecting the same version of events. Lucas asked a simple question that evening. "Does that mean they don't agree anymore?" "It means," I said carefully, "that people start protecting themselves when things are written down." He accepted that answer without fear. The outcome arrived without ceremony. Boundaries were formalized, authority shifted, oversight expanded, communication routes were narrowed and defined. Nothing was announced. It simply took effect. Margaret's final message to me came late that night. "You didn't have to do this," she wrote. I read it once. Then I closed my phone, because the truth doesn't argue its necessity. It proceeds. The house settled into a new quiet, one that didn't depend on avoidance. Doors stayed open. Questions were answered plainly. No one hurried to fill the space. Lucas noticed the difference immediately. "It feels lighter," he said, sitting at the table with his homework, "like nobody's pretending." "That's because pretending takes energy," I replied, "and it doesn't last." That night, as I turned off the lights, I stood in the hallway and listened. The familiar sounds were there. The clock, the walls settling, the low hum of the house at rest. But the tension that once lived underneath was gone. The plan had collapsed without exposure or confrontation, not because anyone forced it into the light, but because it couldn't survive being seen clearly. Quiet strategies fail when quiet becomes documentation. Lucas didn't need to understand every step that led us here. He only needed to know one thing, that staying silent was no longer required to keep things stable. And once that requirement disappeared, the quiet lost its power. The consequences didn't arrive as punishment. They arrived as structure. Once the process moved forward, decisions were no longer shaped by intention or explanation. They were shaped by responsibility. Clear roles replaced informal authority. Boundaries were defined, not debated. That change mattered more than anything else. Lucas felt it before it was explained to him. "They don't ask me things anymore," he said one morning, sounding surprised. "Not like before." "That's because it's not your job to answer them," I told him. For the first time since I'd arrived, he smiled without checking my face first. A child advocate met with Lucas briefly, not to revisit what he'd already shared, but to make sure he wouldn't be asked to carry it again. She explained what would happen next in simple terms. "You don't have to protect adults," she told him. "Adults protect you." Lucas listened carefully. "Even if I'm quiet?" he asked. "Especially then," she replied. That distinction settled into him slowly. Formal measures followed, each one quiet but firm. Contact became structured. Decisions were reviewed through proper channels. Oversight was no longer optional. It was expected. No one used dramatic language. They didn't need to. When accountability exists, clarity does the work. Margaret was informed of the next steps through official communication. The tone was neutral, professional, final. Explanations were acknowledged, but no longer central. The focus had shifted from why things happened to what would ensure they didn't happen again. That shift changed everything. Lucas didn't ask about Margaret, not right away. Instead, he asked about routines. "Will I still go to school the same way?" "Yes." "Can I still draw after dinner?" "Yes." "Are you staying?" "Yes." That answer mattered most. Protection, I was learning, isn't loud. It's consistent. We focused on what could be made predictable: meals, bedtime, mornings, small decisions that told Lucas the world around him wasn't about to tilt again. He tested that stability gently. One evening, he didn't speak at dinner, not out of fear, out of choice. He ate slowly, thinking. I didn't comment. Later, as we washed dishes, he said, "It feels different when I'm quiet now." "How so?" I asked. "It doesn't feel like I'm hiding," he said. "It just feels like resting." That was the shift. Silence was no longer a shield. It was an option. The formal outcomes were confirmed over time, not announced all at once. Adjustments were made, safeguards put in place. Each one reinforced the same principle. The child's well-being came first. No one asked Lucas to understand the details. He didn't need to. His world narrowed again, to school, to home, to ordinary concerns. The weight of adult decisions lifted from his shoulders. One afternoon, while we walked home from school, he asked a question that caught me off guard. Was I supposed to notice all those things? I stopped walking. "No," I said carefully. "You noticed because you were paying attention. That doesn't make it your responsibility." He thought about that for a long moment. "But I'm glad I said something," he said. "So am I replied. "And I'm glad you didn't have to say it alone." That evening, the house felt settled in a way it hadn't before. Not empty, not tense, grounded. The kind of grounding that comes when expectations are clear and roles are correct. Lucas slept more deeply, not because the past had disappeared, but because it no longer hovered. Protection doesn't erase what happened. It prevents it from happening again. As the days passed, I understood that this part of the story wasn't about consequences in the way people usually imagine them. It was about choice. A choice to prioritize safety over appearance. A choice to believe a child without demanding proof beyond his words. A choice to replace silence as control with silence as rest. Those choices didn't make noise. They didn't need to. They changed the future quietly, one boundary, one routine, one protected moment at a time. And in a house that once depended on silence to function, something new had taken root. Not fear, not control, but care. The new life didn't arrive with relief. It arrived with routine. Mornings stayed simple. Breakfast at the same table. Shoes lined up by the door. The same walk to school, past the same trees that never seemed to change no matter what happened inside a house. Lucas moved through these mornings carefully at first, as if expecting something to shift without warning. It didn't. That was the beginning of healing. At school, no one made announcements. There were no explanations offered on his behalf. He returned to his desk, his books, his quiet focus. His teacher noticed small changes before anything else. He asks questions now, she told me one afternoon. Not many, just enough. Enough meant something. At home, Lucas set the pace. Some days he talked more than I expected, about drawings, about a game he'd played, about a thought that came to him while reading. Other days he stayed quiet, content to exist beside me without filling the space. I learned not to interpret either. Healing doesn't move in a straight line. It circles, it pauses, it revisits old ground and then lets it go again. The therapist explained it in simple terms. For a long time, she said, quiet meant responsibility. Now it needs to mean choice. So we practiced choice. When Lucas went quiet, I stayed present but didn't lean in. When he spoke, I listened without correcting or redirecting. No one rushed him toward conclusions or lessons. One evening, as we sat at the table drawing, he looked up and said, "You don't get worried when I don't talk." "No," I replied, "I trust you." He nodded, absorbing that like something new. There were moments when the past surfaced unexpectedly. Raised voices on television made him stiffen. Sudden changes in plans unsettled him. But the difference now was what came after. He didn't disappear. He named it. "That feels too loud," he'd say, or "Can we slow down?" And we did, without explanation. Weekends became quieter in a different way, not structured, just open. Walks through Willow Creek, trips to the library, simple meals cooked together. One Saturday morning, while we were making pancakes, Lucas paused mid-stir. "Is it okay if I'm not quiet anymore?" he asked. I smiled. "It's okay if you are, and it's okay if you're not." He considered that. "I think I like choosing," he said. That sentence marked more progress than any milestone could have. The legal matters continued quietly in the background, handled by people whose job it was to handle them. Updates arrived when they needed to. Decisions were followed through. None of it defined our days anymore. Lucas didn't ask about details. He didn't need to. His world had narrowed to things that felt manageable again. One evening, as I cleaned up after dinner, I heard him talking softly in his room. Not nervously, not rehearsing, just telling a story to himself. I stopped in the hallway and listened, not because I was worried, but because it felt like proof. Later, he asked something quietly. "Do you think I was quiet because I was scared?" he said, "or because I was paying attention?" I thought for a moment. "I think you were paying attention," I said, "and now you don't have to do that alone." He seemed satisfied with that answer. Sleep came more easily now. The light could be turned off without negotiation. The house settled at night without that watchful tension I'd noticed when I first arrived. Some days were still hard. Healing doesn't erase memory, but even the hard days ended. They didn't stretch endlessly the way fear does. One afternoon, walking home from school, Lucas said something that told me more than any report ever could. "I don't feel invisible anymore," he said. I stopped. "You never were," I replied. He nodded. "I know, but now it feels like people notice without me having to make sure." That was the shift. The past hadn't vanished. It had lost its authority. In its place was something quieter and stronger. A home that didn't require vigilance. A routine that didn't depend on silence to function. A child learning that his voice didn't disrupt stability. It created it. And slowly, without being pushed, Lucas began to understand something he'd never been allowed to test before, that he could speak or stay quiet. And either way, he would still be safe. People often ask how stories like this end. They expect a moment, a final conversation, a clear line drawn under everything. But this story didn't end that way. It softened. I realized things had truly changed on an ordinary evening, weeks later, when Lucas was sitting at the table telling me a story that wandered without urgency. It moved from a drawing he wanted to finish to a question about the moon, then drifted into something he'd noticed on the walk home. Halfway through, he stopped and laughed. "I forgot what I was saying," he said. And I didn't rush him back to the point. I just listened. For a long time, quiet had meant something very specific in this house. It meant staying out of the way. It meant not asking. It meant helping adults keep things smooth. But now, quiet meant something else. It meant rest. Lucas still had quiet days. Days when he preferred books to conversation, when he watched more than he spoke. But those days no longer felt tense. They didn't feel like something waiting to go wrong. They felt chosen. One night, as I tucked him in, he asked a question I hadn't expected. "Is being quiet bad?" he asked. I thought about it carefully. "No," I said. "Being quiet isn't bad. Being unheard is." He considered that for a moment, then nodded. The remaining decisions unfolded without drama. Boundaries held. Routines stayed intact. Accountability existed, not as a spectacle, but as structure. I didn't mark the day it all concluded. We didn't need to. What mattered had already been decided in smaller, steadier ways. Lucas continued therapy, learning words for feelings he'd once kept folded inside, learning that disagreement didn't equal danger, that asking a question didn't create instability, that his voice didn't disrupt calm. It helped build it. One afternoon, while we were walking through Willow Creek, he said something quietly. "I think I was waiting for someone who wouldn't get upset if I talked." My chest tightened. "I'm glad you waited," I said, "and I'm glad you didn't wait forever." He smiled, certain. At home, evenings stayed simple. Dinner, dishes, a book before bed. Some nights were talkative, some weren't. Both belonged to him. Late one night after he fell asleep, I stood in the doorway and listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing. No tension, no alertness, just sleep. I thought about how easily quiet children are misunderstood. How often silence is mistaken for strength, or worse, agreement. How many truths go unnoticed simply because they arrive softly. This story doesn't end with confrontation. It ends with attention. A child who no longer has to measure every word. An adult who learned that listening is an act of protection. A home where silence isn't demanded, but respected. Lucas found his voice. But more importantly, he found a place where he didn't have to choose between speaking and being safe. And I learned something too, that the quietest people aren't weak. They're often the ones paying the closest attention. Sometimes all they're waiting for is someone safe enough to hear them. And when that happens, when listening replaces assumption, quiet stops being a shield. It becomes peace.